Bismillah. Welcome to Civil Society, a podcast about Islam, culture, and politics. Civil Society is a Noble Savagery production, and I'm your host, Noble Savage, also known as Dr. Zara Khan. I'm very happy today to be sitting with Sidi Rhamis Kent. Sidi Rhamis, thank you for taking the time to have a conversation with me today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for the invite. And I have to say that name, Noble Savage, it's fire.
Thank you.
Sure.
Of course, New Maroon Getaway, you know all about that,
Oh
but
yeah.
a lot of people don't. But thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So if I wouldn't mind, Sidi Rami, beginning by asking you to share with us your own reflections and observations. How are you finding American Muslims within the broader landscape today? What are some issues and points that you're noticing?
I mean, again, I have to preface this, with I am by no means anyone that anybody should bother listening to about any of this stuff. I'm a person in the world, kind of observing things, and I guess certain ways of thinking about it, on the kind of understanding or explaining it. But I think, the human condition, right? It's a amazing thing to kind of witness and experience how people move through the world and how they're trying to navigate it. And I think that's kind of a general point, that's worth making. But I think it's where I think we're at an interesting point in history. I think it's everything we're seeing is sort of proof positive to the whole sort of the principle of entropy. you know this idea that that sort of energy and things kind of tend towards, I mean, typically it's described as chaos, and I don't necessarily subscribe to the view of it's chaos. It's just things move into kind of forms and expressions of energy that are just more difficult to capture and characterize.
Mhm.
And I think that's said to it would confound the scholars, it would confound the people of knowledge. And 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 I think the interesting thing about that point is I think it highlights the fact that knowledge is not necessarily enough. There's this is the Quran tells us Allah he taught the book and the wisdom.
Mhm.
And the book is the knowledge. The wisdom is how do you put the knowledge to use. And I've said, on a number of occasions, in talking about this kind of thing, so I don't necessarily question what people know, whether or not they know the things that they've spent a lot of time to learn. What I often have doubts about, and I think legitimate doubts about, is people's ability to exercise good judgment and make use of what they know.
No, mashallah, I think that's a very profound observation for you to share, profound reflection. Um, Number one, because knowledge being an amana, and number two, a lot of I think the one of the ways that Rene Guénon has characterized like the modern period, right? He'll say that there's a ceaseless agitation and there's action without necessarily the purpose behind the action. And I'm not sure when you were mentioning about chaos and entropy, if that's, if precisely that's what, what you were referring to, but I think that there can be a way of seeing a lot of what we're seeing today among, let's say, American Muslims, but also just in general, the social landscape in general, that there's a lot of action, but it's not necessarily being guided by
Yeah.
clearly understood principle of action.
Sure.
And then it might just be momentum, which has been pushing forward in a particular direction and now has come to kind of these types of conclusions, right? Which I think someone in your position, mashallah, someone who you're working with Zaytuna with the Center for Ethical Living and Learning. And I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to ask you also about, like through your written work and also through conversations we've had in the past, that for you, the the ethics, the Quran, the Sunnah, the Islamic ethics and practices are never divorced from questions of like, regeneration of land, to be specific, but also building communities and that type of engagement. And I imagine that your role right now at Z-Cell is continuing to put a lot of that into practice, as you have for many years, mashallah.
Is it's an attempt to try to, sort of make real or sort of operationalize ultimately what kind of what the real concern of religion is, right? What is the concern of, fiqh, the jurisprudence? Well, it's about how, the guidelines, or it sets the parameters for kind of how to operate in, a number of different fields of endeavor, in the course of your life. Okay, well, what are the main sort of branches? What are the main concerns? Well, there's the ibadat, which is, worship, and effectively it's how you tend to your debts to Allah, right? And then there's the mu'amalat, right? The how you deal or tend to your debts in relation to the creation, right? And so if we're able to do the things that are appropriate and that are due from us to both Allah and the creation, then the way that sort of everything sort of responds in kind to your tending to your debts that's where I think you get, a kind of a harmonious, beneficial result, because everybody's taking care of their responsibilities, right? They're taking care of what's due from them to everything that you come into contact with that you are sort of obliged to deal with. And if you don't, right, then that's where you begin to see problems. So I think the whole point behind, the sort of the remit of, and the concern, the focus of Z-Cell is, okay, well, how do you operationalize these ideas and these understandings as a practical matter, right? How do you take them out of the realm of sort of abstraction and kind of concept, and
Right.
how do you actually make it like deployable to where the way that you go about living in the world and the way you go about sort of creating or fashioning a world according to these principles. Okay, well, what does that look like? And what are the methods? What are the structures, right? What are the procedures? What are the protocols? What is the form, right? So if we really are serious, about, I think, our practice of religion, i.e., if we're really serious about the way that we live a life such that we tend to our debts, then we should be able to articulate that very clearly, and then demonstrate it by actually creating these things that then allows for us to live in accord with, what we claim.
Like all of the rights of the other individuals in creation, they ultimately reside in the rights of God. So to take care of the one is the same as, being worshipful and mindful of our obligations to the Lord. And it seems that what the projects that you're mentioning, the Pearl, as well as what you're doing in California right now, it's not, in addition to everything you described, the practical knowledge, right? So this is also like an epistemological, I think, pushback against very alienated forms in society. I'm always telling my kids, like, we get our food from the grocery store, and I'm trying to explain to them that that is fundamentally a very strange situation to be in. Not that I'm, it's a necessity, and alhamdulillah, it's an ease that we have to be able to do that, but nonetheless there's a form of alienation because we completely lack the knowledge.
I mean, historically, what a lot of historians or historiographers, often say is that the thing that allowed for human beings to live in, as sedentary, dense populations, right, in a place, is it's their ability to manage that place such that it can produce the things that allow for them to be there for an extended period of time, right? And that's agriculture, right? It's having the ability to cultivate the place where you are in such a manner that it's able to provide you with the things that you need. And if there, and I think you can say, if there's any sort of two things, or the things that you need provided to you, or made available to you, if you're going to live amongst a group of folks like that, is you need to be provisioned. You need to have, again, the stuff that would allow for you to live a decent, dignified life, and you need to be protected, right? So like provisioning and protection is what is like, those are the central concerns of any community at any scale. Whether you're talking about your own household, or whether you're talking about yourself, or whether you're talking about, again, kind of a larger civic household, is you have to be provisioned, and you have to be protected, because ultimately you need to be preserved, right? If you're going to live, you got to be preserved. And those are like the essentials of being preserved. And then that has to be done in a manner that is judicious. It has to be wise. It has to be intelligent. It can't be it can't be done willy-nilly or carelessly, right? Or without any thought. And so if, and hopefully it's done in a manner that does not diminish anybody else's ability to provide those things for themselves. So there's also, if that's the case, then there's sort of a set of principles, or the set of ethics that are going to guide or direct the manner in which you pursue those, those endeavors that you're going to try to secure those things. That then ensures that the rights of others are being properly honored, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
And so that sort of that sense of reciprocity, and this understanding that we have an enlightened self-interest in thinking about others, is, I think that's central to what we were just talking about, in terms of, the being in possession of the knowledge or a certain understanding. You kind of have the stuff to be able to pull from. That then, if you're able to use that information properly and judiciously, that then how to, in a given context, how to put those things to work, right? And such that you can create benefit from it.
Mashallah. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. The rights and the responsibilities are two sides of the same coin. And when you have a society that's all rights and no duties, you end up having a very vacuous and exploitative society, which is, of course, what we see in our own society, which is completely debt-ridden and debt-based and credit-based and interest-based, right? Interest-based lending and whatnot.
I got to get mine, and other people need to, give me mine. Right. And then there's a demand, right? There's a demand that becomes central, right? As opposed to, again, let's flip that, and everybody is of the mind that they're thinking, what can I do for you? Right. And then if everybody kind of everyone's kind of mutually all thinking about how they live in that manner, right? What can I do for you? Then everyone sort of is automatically covered, right? You create what I often like to call a network of mutual concern.
Right.
And I think any real community is, functionally speaking, it is the result of this formation of a network of mutual concern. So if everybody's extending themselves to everyone else, like, what can I do for you? I mean, that is the realization of this idea that none of you truly believes unless you love for your brother, or you love for your sister what you love for yourself.
True is for yourself, subhanAllah.
Right? That's
yeah.
That's the thinking that is infused in that statement. Right? None of you truly believes, right? Or the other hadith I love, when the Prophet ﷺ says that, he said creatures, all of them, right, are the dependents of God. Right. And the one who is most beloved to God is the creature who is of most benefit to his dependents. Right. So bam, there it is. Like, kind of everything is sort of laid out, right, in terms of what am I what am I trying to ultimately, what am I trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish in the course of my living? And especially as a person who um, subscribes to a faith tradition, and certainly if you subscribe to the faith tradition of Islam, is like you ultimately you want to be loved by God. You want to arrive to God. Like the goal is God, right? And you wanted to be loved by God. Okay, well, how do you become someone that's loved by God? Be a benefit to other, to others. The Allah would love you, right? You will be, and ultimately that is, I mean, if you want to know what's at the heart of the Sunnah, right? That the one who's beloved to Allah is the one who's of most benefit to his dependents. How is that not the Prophet?
Yeah.
Right. He's
An
Habibullah.
exemplar, absolutely.
Right. He's Habibullah. He's Habib. Why is he Habibullah? Because he's the one who is a benefit to the whole creation, right? Because he's Rahmatul lil Alameen, right? He's a mercy to all of the worlds.
MashaAllah. No, Jazakallah khair, Sidi Rhamis. And it harkens me back to your paper that you published with Yaqeen, Saving Truth and Beauty, the Destruction of Nature and the Islamic Solution. And the way that the way you've written that paper and the way you've argued through that paper, pertaining to stewardship and pertaining to the sanctity of Allah's creation, pertaining to our role within the broader cosmos and our obligations, as you just mentioned, the ayat in another translation, all creatures are the family of God, right? And so the way that you framed it really reminds me in a very similar fashion to the way that Dr. Adi Setia, the way he's written his articles on Islamic Gifts Economy. So I'm really glad you just made the reflection that you did, because it's bringing us right to where the next thing I wanted to speak with you about and ask
about. See how that segue worked? See how that?
Perfect. Yeah. Mashallah. Mashallah. Actually, I'll throw a quick detour in there, and I hope it's not too off topic. But
no. But I'm all about detours.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So Studio Ghibli, right? Miyazaki, director, of course.
100%. Yeah.
Why would you not? But so one of the things that I do with my students, and this is like whether I'm teaching literature, I'm teaching like Western political thought, is we'll watch Princess Mononoke, right? It's one of my favorite movies of all time. And I always posit like Lady Eboshi, who's the antagonist in that film, with Ashitaka and his people, the protagonist. And for those who haven't seen it, definitely watch Princess Mononoke by Studio Ghibli. It's an amazing film.
And all the rest of them.
Right, absolutely. And so you have, on the one hand, both of these are productive societies. They both have a very specific relationship to agriculture and animal husbandry. And then they also both have, I guess you could say, a social welfarist um, tint to them as well, in terms of like taking care of people in society and acknowledging that there are different members of society with different vulnerabilities. But the two models are so completely different. One we would call perhaps a traditional worldview, which would be Ashitaka and his village, where wisdom is valued more than knowledge of the physical world. And the knowledge, in the West, at some point, the only knowledge that mattered was the knowledge that could help you conquer and have power over other things, not over yourself necessarily.
Yeah.
And then the other society, Lady Eboshi's Irontown, is definitely like post-industrial, hyper-capitalist, very individualistic, even though she does have a social welfareism. She takes care of women who she buys out of prostitution contracts, and she takes care of people who are lepers. And so there is that aspect. It's a perfect analogy for the United States, I think. Irontown is, because it's expansionist, right? It's expand or die. And one of the things I ask the students is, the difference between knowledge and wisdom is how much knowledge did it take to put the atomic bomb together? Leading up to World War II, it took a lot of knowledge. It took recruiting scientists from all over the world in a number of disciplines, mathematicians, to come together and work in secrecy and race to like create this monstrosity. But it would have taken only a very small amount of wisdom to know not to deploy it, right? To actually drop it on civilian populations or at all. And so the difference between knowledge and wisdom, I think, can be a difference that's very consequential. And whether we're talking about permaculture or more spiritually, Islamically infused, as you do, both in your paper and in your work, vision of working with the land or regenerating economies and making them more comprehensive one of the things that that I was thinking as you were speaking was that Dr. Adi's framework for Islamic Gifts Economy, it's based on a number of principles that when we compare them to like our economic systems today, they're completely different, right? So his vision is like a new economic vision, but he's certain that it's viable.
Yeah.
It's not only viable, it's the only viable option for human beings, right? So basing his vision on cooperation and mutual consent and partnership, and then this itself being built upon deeper Islamic principles of mercy and gratitude, generosity and moderation, and what he calls the psycho-cosmological outlook being very different than, let's say, a
Yeah.
neoliberal economic order of the world. So I was wondering if you might, share some of your knowledge with us about that.
Yeah. I mean, so, again, the shout out to Dr. Adi Setia, who, I'm, I mean, we're colleagues, but I'm a fan. It certainly is a student of, Professor Alatas. And you can see it in his methodology, to where, he spends a lot of time like defining terms and really trying to set what, I call, the cognitive frame. What are sort of the fundamental assumptions that form the basis of the idea that is being put forward. And so it's not assumed that those assumptions are understood. They need to be very explicitly expressed and set up. So we take time to go through what I often like to call, we answer the big questions, right? The big
Mm-hmm.
questions would be like the cosmological and cosmogonical one, right? What is the world, and where does it all come from, right? And what is this arrangement? Then there's the ontological question, what am I, or what is this? The epistemological question, what do we know, or what do we think we
Mm-hmm.
know, or how do I know that I know? How do I know that I know what I think I know?
Mm-hmm.
um,
Right.
there's the sort of the teleological question. What am I supposed to be doing? Why am I here? The soteriological question. What do I need to be doing in order to ultimately meet with a favorable end? The axiological question: what are the values that I should be living according to? What should I? What are the
Mm-hmm.
guidelines? The eschatological question: what are the, ultimately, where am I going? Right. And so this is helping to set up, again, sort of the cognitive boundaries, the parameters
Mm-hmm.
within which I'm operating. And I think and in sort of the putting forward this vision that is articulated within the Islamic Gift Economy, the IGE, and also the sort of the practical deploying of the Islamic Gift Economy framework, which would be the Pearl, right? The Program
Mm-hmm.
for Ethical, Appropriate, and Regenerative Livelihoods. And all of that is housed under what we call the Institute for Regenerative Livelihoods, or IRL. It's looking at the basis upon which we think about all of these things with respect to, economics. Trying to define, okay, well, what do you mean by economics? The conventional explanation as to what economy is, how it's defined and what it's concerned about. Economy is typically, or economics is typically defined as the production and consumption of goods and services, made from scarce resources, or finite resources.
Yeah.
So, where etymologically, that's not what the word means. That's not what it is. If you look at etymologically where that word comes from, oikonomia, right?
Household. Yeah.
So it's about it's about managing the household, or
Mm-hmm.
more, I think, or more precisely, it's 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 the judicious management of the resources of the household, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That is what economy is effectively concerned with. How do you judiciously manage the resources of the household, such as the needs of those that are residing or occupying the household? Their needs are met with, right?
And
They're
judiciously,
provided.
like you
And,
said. So
and
there's a different set of values,
right.
like inherent. And I'm sorry, I'm just gonna jump in real quick.
Yep.
That and so Dr. Adi points out that traditionally, and to this day, I mean traditionally as in, from its roots to how economy is understood and discoursed about today, that it's based on these two flawed propositions. One, as you were mentioning, this like a scarcity mindset
Yep.
having to do with material resources being scarce, whereas one of the first principles of Islamic Gifts Economy is that cultural as well as material resources of human beings are abundant.
Yep.
So it brings an abundance mindset as opposed to a scarcity
A
mindset.
scarcity
And
mindset.
then and we know in Western civilization that anxiety over scarcity has managed so much of politics and economy and society, like
Yeah.
from John Malthus and his Malthusian economics, and the idea that there's simply not enough for everybody, but that really as a cover to very exploitative structures and relationships, like hoarding grains and
Right.
well, hoarding crude oil even today, right? But the other flawed
Or
proposition,
housing. Or housing. I mean, that's
oh,
one of the main things that's
absolutely.
being hoarded now is BlackRock. And I just saw read an article that basically the top 1% in this country could own 99% of the housing. Own it.
That's insane. Yeah.
1%. Right. And so,
Through banking and financing. Yeah.
right. And then seeing the provisioning of the needs of people as a way of being able to hoard wealth, right? Which is
Right.
just deeply problematic, as opposed to that there's a chance that all of the needs of people could be provided with no problem at all.
Right.
Right. If that was seen as being a worthy goal to pursue. But if again there's a view that, number one, for example, the idea that people have a right to housing, right? People have a right to health care, people have a right to like the idea that people have rights to these things is seen as being a stretch.
Yeah.
Right. I was just watching a clip of the I can't remember what documentary it was, but it was the CEO of Nestle talking about how some people believe that everyone has a right to water, right? Which
Imagine that.
he actually said in the clip, he thought this was an extreme position. It's ajib, right? It's
Subhanallah.
amazing that people having the right to water is an extreme position, and he said, as opposed to water being a foodstuff that has a particular market value, right? That
So
demands
commodified.
it be
Yeah.
managed. I mean, that is a very particular worldview that comes out of a very particular set of assumptions that's made about the world, right? And what should be,
Absolutely.
right? And
And
then
about
what
the
and all
human
these
being.
people are doing
Right.
is that they're imposing this on people. It's not necessarily a given that is in fact the reality, right? That is an imposed rendering.
So Dr. Adi would say that it's a lack of shukr in the values and the mindset, because for Islamic Gifts Economy, moving on the principle of shukr leads to abundance, both spiritual and material, as opposed to coming from a creditor, where the creditors are the principal actors in the play of society, and their protection is more important than the protection of, for example, people's rights to housing and water. You had Obama after the meltdown in 2008, his response to bail out Wall Street meant that 10 million Americans had to lose their homes, right? And right now, I don't know if you remember this, Sidi Rhamis, but years ago you recommended this book to me, by Michael Hudson,
Oh
and
yeah,
forgive them their
and forgive them
debts.
their debts. Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, you got it.
And so, yeah, no, I read it. And as you were
Good.
speaking right now, Yeah, it's an amazing work. Mashallah, this man is an economic genius
Brilliant,
and a
brilliant,
historian. And so, as
brilliant.
you were speaking just now, you're talking about who has a right and who gets covered, and this hoarding mindset, and really, like Dr. Adi would say, a lack of shukr and a lack of zuhd, a lack of detachment. Where I found it fascinating that some of the things that, I teach Western thought, and I always begin with, what do we mean when we say the West? And talk about this forging of Hellenic ancestry, and how the West at one point in its civilizational history decided it's going to go back and write its own birth certificate and say, like, Greece was not part of the Mediterranean, and Greece had nothing to do with Egypt. Greece was kind of this standalone ancestor to what would later be, right? So they kind of
Yeah.
forged this. So much of what formed the basis of Western civilization actually came from the Near East, as Hudson is showing, from
Yeah.
Sumer and Babylonia, and like the way money was invented, and
Bronze
interest
Age.
and
Yeah, the Bronze
credit.
Age. Yeah.
Yeah, but the difference being that those societies for thousands of years, into the Jewish law, that they would have these jubilees, this
Jubilees.
debt forgiveness.
That's right.
And now, I remember a few years ago, everyone wondering if there was going to be student loan debt forgiveness. And really, people thought that was an outrageous concept. But what marked the beginning of Western civilization in that antiquitous Greek period was that they took these Eastern commercial and monetary and financial institutions and processes, but they took out the debt
Right.
forgiveness,
Right.
which
They
was,
totally flipped it. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So it became all about the creditor. So the one
Right.
who lends money is the main actor, and is the
Right.
one who by all means will be protected in the system,
Right.
even if it means homelessness for massive amounts of people
Right.
being taken off their land, no longer being a part of civic society, and being able to build infrastructure and serve in the army and do all the things that, like you were saying, preservation meaning provision and protection, right? Removing people from both provision, because now you
Right.
enclose the common lands, and protection. They can't even serve in an army to protect borders.
Right.
And I just find it so fascinating that a couple of thousand years later, we're in the same predicament, having learned nothing from history,
Hundred
and being
percent.
like, this society is going to be all about the creditors, and it's taking down this spiral, subhanallah. But yeah, I wanted to make sure I told you that I read that book
No,
because you
excellent.
recommended
I
it.
like that. That
Alhamdulillah, it's amazing.
you just made my day.
I
So
learned so much.
yeah, mashallah. It's a powerful work. And and Hudson's a brilliant guy. And he talked about how long, I mean, he'd been working on that, with a bunch of other scholars for decades. I think the other problem is, and this is definitely something that Dr. Addis pointed out. The other problem is there's no such thing as contentment. Like there's no such thing as
Mhm,
enough, which is
mhm.
also one of the central problems of this whole proposition that the creditors are central. The centrality of the creditors here. And if you don't believe that there is such a thing as enough, this is what it produces. This is exactly what it produces. Where you get
Mhm.
billionaires, right? You get people that have hundreds of billions of dollars, a single individual. Right? Does he need that?
Well, Allah
As I'm
tells us, right?
huh?
Allah tells us that of those who are obsessed with greed for more and more until they go down to their graves, and they're not going to be able to have any of that avail them
Yeah.
on the
So
day of
so
judgment.
right. And then not only that, I mean, it's like, one of the hadiths about, the Prophet ﷺ talks about the sort of the metaphysical reality of those that hoard. And when we say hoarders, we're not talking about the person that, buys up all the toothpaste at the CVS and stores it in the basement. Like hoarders are
Right.
people that they hoard things that are considered to be like necessities. And again, and it's necessities at a particular scale such that it is affecting other people that need that thing. And that
Hmm.
the metaphysical reality of those that hoard on the Yom, it says that they're resurrected with murderers. And because that's really what you're doing.
SubhanAllah.
People are that these are people that denying the capacity to be able to secure the things that folks need to live a dignified life. They are preventing people from accessing that so they can make money.
In opposition to the principles of Islamic Gifts Economy that say that the community interest takes precedence always over the private
Hundred
interest.
percent, 100%. If I can refer to a cultural reference, You know, it ain't no fun unless the homies can have some.
Mm.
Or it ain't no fun unless, you know, the homies can't have none, right? Because you know, it's all about part of your enjoying what you have is that other people are there to enjoy it with you.
Right. All of us or none of us,
All
basically.
of us or none of us. Like if I got it,
Mm-hmm.
you got it, right? If I got it,
Mm-hmm.
you got it. Because I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to be here by myself, right? Like I got everything and everybody else is miserable. But also, you know, there's also an understanding that, you know, if you don't have enough of something that you need, I'm in danger. Because at some
Mm-hmm.
point, the people that don't have enough are going to go, they're going to go to the person that has more than they can possibly use. And they're probably going to do something out of desperation to endanger not only them, like they're going to endanger themselves and they're going to endanger you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why this part,
Well, we're seeing that everywhere, right? Yeah.
100%,
S- Storming the
100%.
gates. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just, it's kind of having enough of a sort of like presence of mind to realize that, like, again, you have that there is this enlightened self-interest to think of others aside from yourself, because you know that if others are not taken care of, it's not going to work out well for you in the long run,
Mm-hmm.
right?
What do you
So
think?
yeah.
What do you think might be some practical ways to put these principles of mutual help and commonality, reciprocity, compassion, harmony? How can we put some of these principles into action to begin reforming economy at very local levels or in very kind of local ways? What would you recommend if someone were looking to think about Islamic gifts economy as a viable option and try to move piece by piece away from, being embedded in a neoliberal global capitalist economic system? Or what are some things you've seen that maybe could inspire us?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned it, and if I can actually refer to something you wrote, you know, about that very topic, al-Kaf. I mean, for example, I think it was in your paper you pointed out that something like 75% of the arable land in the Ottoman Empire was actually held as al-Kaf, right? And
Hmm.
so, fine, it's privately held land or a privately held asset that then is actually it's sort of given over for, you know, public use or use for the greater good. That if you are in possession of wealth or some kind of surplus, that it benefits you by allowing others to be able to be benefited by that surplus. So how
Hmm.
do you create institutions that operate off of that premise, right?
Hmm.
Because the problem is it's the fundamental premise from which you're operating. Like if the
Hmm.
idea is not sound, then the institution itself isn't going to be doing what it needs to be doing to provide what is ultimately needed, from micro to macro scale,
Okay.
right? Whether you're talking about your own house or your own village or your town or your city or your county or your region or your state or whatever, that there are certain things that people should be given access to, because those people need to be seen as being assets to the community.
Hmm.
This I was thinking about this the other day, is that if there's any common theme that you see throughout, I think a lot of, you know, sort of kind of Western thought, at least over the last 500 years, is the disposability of people.
Oh, goodness, yes. Yeah.
It's people as being disposable, like that they don't have any
Hmm.
value aside from what they can be used to produce for you. Kind of we're being presented with the prospect of AI taking over everything, right?
Hmm.
So is that ultimately, I mean, there's a great book that was written in the late 60s, early 70s, called it was written by Sidi Wilhelm, called Who Needs the Negro? And it's funny because then there's another book that was written around the same time, Samuel Yet, called The Choice. And again, this kind of deals with the topic of, you know, the obsolescence of people. And specifically, Wilhelm was talking about the obsolescence of, you know, Black Americans, right? And he said
Hmm.
that basically the future of the Black American is more like that of the, you know, ultimately what happened to the Native American, the indigenous, of the United States, as opposed to the poor European immigrant. Because, he wrote this book at the time when kind of automation,
Okay, so 1950s.
Yes, going into the 60s. And he wrote this
Yeah.
actually, kind of in the midst of the unrest of the late 60s, that, automation would effectively make Black Americans obsolete, right? Because you no longer needed them for the original purpose that they were brought here. You don't need them for labor, right? So they're economically unnecessary. And you didn't want them, to like in the society because they're seen as being socially undesirable. So if they're economically unnecessary and they're socially undesirable, why would you do anything for them? Right. And so he was saying, like, well, this is what you saw happen with the indigenous American, because they were tolerated, up until the point that they were no longer seen as being useful.
Having
right,
a value. Yeah.
Right. So originally they had value because they were good and when trapping and hunting and things, people dealing with pelts and hides and things, they were seen as being like really helpful in that respect. And obviously as guides and scouts and all this stuff. And in the moment that was, that was no longer a thing, you get rid of them. Right. Because they're economically unnecessary and socially undesirable. And I think similarly, but only now with the prospect of, artificial intelligence, and especially artificial intelligence that is then used to do the work that you would, that you were relying on people to do. And this time it's not just the quote unquote, the minorities, right? Quote unquote.
Right.
Now they're coming for the white collar workers, right? So now it's programmers, it's lawyers, it's, any it's sort of this kind of knowledge, quote unquote, knowledge based industries, like those jobs are going too, right?
Don't get me started. Yeah,
well,
please don't get me started on
saying,
GPT and AI and transhumanism and subhanallah.
But again, that's the theme of human disposability.
Yeah.
That's the that's like one of the constants that I think you see play out. One of the common threads you see play out in a lot of sort of Western history over the last few hundred years is that, I mean, one of the other great books is Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery.
Okay.
Where the same principle it plays out. And he says right at the beginning of the book, first of all, that slavery and that racism, quote unquote, did not necessarily need to be a thing in order for slavery to be a thing. And initially it wasn't. Right? Because first they would rely on indentures, really the undesirables, the persona non grata. So it could be felons, for example, at least in Britain's case, right? Okay. And then eventually
forced labor and whatnot. Yeah.
Then you have indentures, right? Well, indentures don't work out because eventually the time that they are kind of serving in that role, eventually you time out because you pay off your debt. And so the problem is you don't have enough labor. First they went to the indigenous, and then that didn't work out, and then eventually they go to the African. That worked out, and then being able to use enough violence to get people to force people to work. You needed to have the assurance that you would have that labor capacity available to you, right? And then, and of course, the advent of industrialization then allows for you to again have access to that labor capacity. But one of the things that apparently Jefferson had said early on was that it was cheaper to use labor in a manner that used up land, right? And instead of actually doing the work that would be necessary to revive or regenerate or repair that land, that it was actually cheaper for them to use the land up and then go find a new plot of land.
Wow. So just basically the calculus of gain and loss financially is the only one that matters. So the land is not sacred, human life is not sacred, principles are not sacred.
Which I think is a stunning statement.
Right.
Because effectively what it is a repudiation of the whole concept, the whole idea of stewardship. right?
Yeah,
Which
it's the
is,
diametrically opposed vision.
yeah,
Absolutely.
which is in our tradition, that's what we were made for.
Hmm.
We were made to do that. And we were given the equipment, right? And the capabilities to perform that job and to do it well. And that ultimately it was in serving in that role and performing those duties, performing those functions, that's ultimately what sort of prepares us to be then capable of arriving to God.
Subhanallah. Imam Fode Drame, may Allah increase him and preserve
I
him.
mean,
He once said that, the solution, or a solution to being removed from your fitra, from your primordial nature, which as Muslims we believe to be one of God consciousness,
mm-hmm,
that the solution to being too far removed or corrupted from your own fitra is animal husbandry, right? and
100%.
and by extension agricultural work, and you could say putting your hands in the land. And that, it's Muslims who had, in our history, not to be romantic about Islamic history, but it's Muslims who in our history came up with the idea of crop rotation, and letting a part of the land rest while you cultivate another part of the land, and to come back in rotation. And if you think about it, that principle, imagine applying that principle in your own family, right? Or in your own community,
Well,
or in your own masjid with relationships with other people, or a business co-op,
yeah,
and
because the thing is,
mutual
it's
lending and mutual
so,
aid.
yeah, so this is where, you know, in the paper, in my paper, I mentioned that, that quote from Ar-Raghib
Mhm,
al-Isfahani, where he talks about the sort of the existential purpose of the sort of creation of the human being. Like, what were the things that we were supposed to be doing? Like, why were we created? Right. So he mentions
mhm,
three things. He mentions we were created to engage imarat al-ard, right? The betterment of land. Then
mhm.
he mentions ibadat, right? Worship, and then he
Worship.
mentions khilafa, right? Stewardship. Then he says that in the course of, again, engaging those roles, that we were to put to use, or to rule in accordance, right, to govern in accordance with the noble qualities of the sacred law of the Sharia. And he mentions five things. He mentions wisdom, justice, forbearance, beneficence, and graciousness, which are actually very close to the cardinal virtues, right?
Right.
Wisdom,
I
justice,
was thinking that.
temperance, courage, right? So so the purpose is engaging those things so that these qualities can be inculcated and refined in people, and that ultimately in refining those qualities, that is what allows for you to be to attain paradise, and then ultimately proximity to God. Like, it's engaging those things that
Hmm.
will then allow for you to develop these qualities that then it enables you to arrive to God. Right.
Hmm.
So the goal is arrive to God. How do I arrive to God? Develop these
Yeah.
qualities. How do I develop these qualities? Do these things. Right.
Yes. Beautiful, mashallah.
This is sort of confirmed by the another hadith, and this is actually in one of the translations that Dr. Addy did with Mahdi Lak, Sidi Mahdi Lak, in the Kitab al-Kasab, Imam Shibani's book, where the Prophet ﷺ is quoted to have said, he's reported to have said, sallallahu alaihi wa sallam, he said that the Azari, the Azari, right, the sower, right, the cultivator of land, the farmer, quote unquote, is trading with his Lord.
Oof.
He's trading, and
Subhanallah.
he tijara. He's trading with his Lord. It is the fundamental. It is the initial fundamental trading that we do that allows for us to then do all the other trading, right? Because
Hmm.
where do you get the goods to enter into business with? You get it from cultivating land. That's the
Yeah.
first
God bless
trade,
the farmers.
right? No,
Right.
seriously, that's the first trade. That is the initial, fundamental, primary trading that we do is with Allah.
I think it says a lot then, and it's a very damning statistic that 90% of the world's food workers live in completely abject conditions because of automation, right? And it might be that if in order to arrive to God, our tradition has this notion of the tazkiyat al-nafs, and we have to purify our souls, and we do it through the practices and the virtues that you mentioned, Sidi. And so then it stands to reason that the opposite of those practices would become a number of veils between you and God, and would continue you on your trajectory and your flight away from God, to the point where we now see for the last several centuries, as you mentioned, that human life is completely disposable. It's just a calculation in an accounting book, to calculate costs and profits. And in Colombia, they have actually a very despicable way of referring to, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, a lot of the way that these states were made, in the modern period, were, like all state making in the modern period, very violent. A lot of heads rolling, a lot of just writing indigenous people out of the national narrative because it doesn't represent the new nation. And so you've actually got a term for uh, people who are peasant farmers. They're not well-to-do. They're not middle class. They're not part of that new nation narrative. And the word for them is desechable, and literally it means disposable. And this is how they refer to the whole group of people that are like displaced from, really, I want to say, ancestral homelands, in order to build out, new amusement parks for the new millennium, for the new nation. So it's really very heartbreaking. And I know David Noble has also written a number of works on automation, in its history, in its early history with IBM and the military, down through more recent decades, and how the displacement of people from their work has led to a lot of, a type of economic violence for a lot of societies in the United States as well. SubhanAllah.
I mean, the other aspect of this that I think is really important to highlight is that, like all the things that we we're just mentioning, like a part of what constitutes like success in this place, and again, operating under a particular rendering of the world, is that the goal is to remove yourself from any involvement with any of those things, because it's seen as being low, right? It's seen as being undignified. It's seen as being an indication of low status. So there's constantly this attempt to try to distance yourself from doing any of the aforementioned, right? Because it doesn't have good connotations in this place. Wendell Berry talks about this. He has a great essay called from Racism in the Economy. He wrote in the late 80s. It's in a collection of essays called The Agrarian Essays of Wendell Berry. I got to get my copy back from Sheikh Hamza. He has this brilliant quote where, basically he says that, even this attempt to try to, this kind of use of these pejoratives that are often ascribed not only to again, kind of quote unquote racial minorities that are often given this, this historically been given this low work to do. But even he said, even if you look at like poor white people, right? And he says, if you look at terms like redneck or hick,
Mm-hmm.
or, trailer trash or whatever the terms are, typically these are terms that are applied to people that are engaged in work that is inescapable, necessary, essential, but inferior. Right?
But inferior.
But inferior. So if there's an attitude that this work that is admittedly inescapable, necessary, fundamental, but inferior, that essential, inescapable, fundamental work is going to be done poorer and poorer,
Mm-hmm.
until basically you erode the very foundations of your society.
And it's so funny, among like Muslim scholars and leaders, this kind of knee-jerk reaction, if people, I don't know if you've heard it, like, that's Marxist, and that's just a way to shut down like a viewpoint or an analysis.
Oh, well, yeah.
But which is, I find it extremely silly. I mean, I don't know if there's an economist more important than Karl Marx in terms of analyzing and critiquing like the actual economic system that constitutes our world. Yes, he was an atheist, but that's not a reason to
Yeah,
throw the
it
baby
doesn't
out with the
negate.
bathwater.
Yeah, it doesn't negate the
Right,
analysis. I mean, and I think this is
right.
where Sayyidina Ali, who said that, you know, that that wisdom and truth is the lost property of the believer. So if
Mm-hmm.
the merits of what he's saying are valid, right?
Right, right.
Then you gotta just admit, you know what, that's true. The solution might be wanting, but it doesn't negate the analysis.
I mean, it's like taking the idea of digging the trench from Salman,
Right,
radiallahu anhu, right? Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam took that idea, even though it originated from a civilization that believed there was a God of light and a God of darkness.
right.
But yeah, so Marx does also speak about that race to the bottom and that spiral downward. You're talking about the quality of the work that'll be done in these essential fundamental industries of life and sustenance. And he was referring to like the quality of production when, you know, in a monopoly situation, and we've all played Monopoly in our life, and someone always ends up flipping the table over at the end, like Isa alayhi salam in the temple, you know, because it's a painful end. Monopoly is always a painful end, as it is in society. And when he's describing what happens, uh, you know, the factory owners, they basically want to cut down their costs in order to maximize their profit
Yeah,
within this sea of competition.
right.
And so it's what he calls a race to the bottom, right?
Yeah,
A
I mean,
downward spiral.
that's exactly it. You know, everything is broken down to that you know, it falls victim to that lowest common denominator, which is there's this devaluing, this its inability to value or appreciate the labor that is involved in the provisioning of goods and services,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's funny because there's a quote from Lincoln, you know, Abraham Lincoln, who says that, you know, to the effect that, you know, holding capital doesn't really do anything for you unless you have the labor that actually makes that capital valuable,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's able to then do the things necessary to turn it into, again, a usable, you know, product or service, right? And that labor has to be
Yeah.
is just as valuable. The labor that is provided is just as valuable as that source capital, if not more so actually, than that source capital that, you know, is being, you know, held by whoever owns it. Is that so? Instead of it being an either or proposition, oh, it's the owner. Oh no, it's the labor. No, they're complementary.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the
So
idea
again,
that
reciprocity, mutuality.
you need both
Yeah,
of them. Like if you don't have either one of the pieces, you need both of the
right.
pieces in order to create the whole. And I think that's also
Yeah.
one of the you know, the fundamental problems with, you know, these worldviews that are put forward. It's not an either or proposition. It's and both. You need both. And
Mm-hmm.
they need to see that they are, you know, that they are mutually necessary in order for either one to be able to benefit, right? But I think it goes back to, you know, the point that I originally started with, like, okay, well, what's the point of, again, Z Cell and IRL and IG Pearl and all these things? It's articulating a vision,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and actually spelling out, you know, what are the principles, what are the ideas, and then, okay, well, then we need we need a means by which a methodology to actually operationalize the principles and the ethics, right? So that we can create the structures, we can create the protocols, we can create the procedures, we can then create the institutions,
Mm-hmm.
right? The systems that we then have a means by which to do all of those things, right? And so that we can actually give a body, you know, to the spirit that's supposed to infuse these ideas, right? And then eventually can be
MashaAllah.
turned into something real. That's the whole point.
Right. Bismillah. Absolutely wonderful conversation, Sidi Rhamis. And, you know, as usual, when we're speaking, you know, I'm just here taking notes. That's what I do. So, Jazakallah khair for your time.
I'm
I want to
shameless plug.
absolutely.
I got a design course at my twice year held permaculture design certification course. The summer course begins on June 16th and July 3rd. I think actually the website just went live yesterday, I think, so that you can register.
I'm gonna link it. I'm gonna link it in the description
Great.
for anyone who. And where is this
Yeah.
located this year?
So it's held at Zaytuna College's the upper
Zaytuna,
campus.
inshallah.
So it's 2-week course. I just tell people you come in to listen to me think out loud for 2 weeks, and we get a chance to do
Right.
some
Well, there's a
stuff.
difference between everyday people thinking out loud and someone who spent a whole lifetime reading, reflecting, contemplating, worshiping. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for your knowledge and your wisdom, for sharing it. Any closing prescriptions for American Muslims? Any of final closing thought on where we should spend our energy at
We're
this
all
moment?
gonna die. We're all gonna die. Make it epic. That's it.
We're all gonna die. Make it epic. Yeah, okay, that's gonna be quoted. Just so you know. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, Sidi Rhamis. Always a pleasure.
Likewise.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.